So everything from a really sort of nice sandy beaches, muddy tidal flats, rocky cliffs, mangrove, vegetated coastlines, coral reefs. And it's also pretty unique in the range of tides we have. So we have a huge range of tide from microtidal environments up to some of the world's largest macrotidal environments up in the northwest of Australia. And the other thing that's pretty unique about a coastline is this sort of dichotomy between our sort of heavily developed east and southern coasts and our extremely remote and inaccessible northern coasts. So this is a combination of length of our coastline and the range of really unique and quite different coastal environments we have makes monitoring Australia's coastlines a pretty challenging thing to do. So it's sort of this sort of combination of dynamic coastlines that change a lot, but also really remote and inaccessible coastlines. Both means it's difficult to monitor, but also that you really need frequent measurements through time to understand how these environments are changing. So it's sort of both challenging and the kind of places where you really need this data to start with. Luckily, satellite data is a really powerful tool for monitoring our coasts through time. So there's been Earth observation satellites run by NASA and the USGS in America since the early 70s, and also more recently satellites from the European Space Agency. And so they've been essentially monitoring the world's coastlines, the world's land extent since about the 70s, and sort of capturing really detailed high resolution data for these places through time. And the really nice thing is this data is being provided for free. And so for the first time, we have this sort of amazing resource that we can use to study how these coastlines are changing, even in places that are very difficult to sample and survey. The problem is that even though this data is technically free, it has historically been really difficult to use. So while there's huge volumes of data out there, it's often in really challenging file formats to analyze. The data volumes themselves are huge, and they're often spread across multiple different platforms that you need different logins, different systems for accessing it. So while it's been available, it's been really sort of quite challenging to actually use and analyze for studying how our coasts are changing. So the program I work in called Digital Earth Australia is essentially tasked with collecting this huge amount of satellite data we have for Australia, gathering it all up into one place, into what we call a data cube. So sort of standardized environment where industry, government, and academia can access this data in a much more consistent and easy way. And so to do this, we use a freely available and open source system called the Open Data Cube. So just to show you what this looks like, on the right, we have a collection of images collected across Australia over the last 32 years. What we do is we take those images, we stack them nicely so they're perfectly aligned through time. And then we also apply calibration to each image so they can be analyzed consistently through time. And so what you end up with is this really sort of nice stack of images for any location in Australia. So for example, if you want satellite imagery of Manly in Sydney, you can say, I want 32 years of data for this area, and you'll get back a nice consistent time series that then lets you study how coastal changes occurred through time. So this is all up produced a pretty vast amount of data. So we manage about 35 years of data since roughly 1986 is when the first Landsat data covers Australia. And so this is about 9 petabytes of data, which is a pretty hard number to wrap your head around. It's about 70,128 megabyte USB drives, which probably doesn't make it any easier to understand how much data it is, but it's a pretty vast data volume. And a lot of our work is to finding ways to analyze this and sort of store it in a way that can be accessed easily by people. And the data is growing all the time as well. So roughly every 3 to 4 days, we have new observations. And for each of those observations, we apply a whole range of calibration steps and processes, basically to make them as consistent as possible. So all that hard work doesn't have to be done by every person who's trying to download the data. You can just access the data straight away and not have to worry about all of the tricky sort of behind the scenes stuff. You can just start using it for science straight away. So even though we have this amazing resource of satellite data, there's still a huge number of issues that make using satellite data for studying our coast challenging. So in this animation on the left, you can see what a sort of typical time series of satellite data looks like at a coastal location. You can see in this, you've got clouds which haven't been masked, you've got turbidity in the water, you've got some breaking waves near rocky shorelines and reef environments. You've got sun glint in some of the images, hazy weather, particularly last year with the smoke from the fires. And the really big one that you can see if you look through the clouds here is that these images aren't taken at a consistent tide height. So you've got some images at low tide, some images at high tide. and in between. And so all these sort of things combine to make it quite tricky to use satellite data to instantly get insights into how our coasts are changing through time. So to sort of get around some of these issues, there's sort of two main techniques we use, and I'm going to talk about them in this talk today. The first technique we use is something called compositing. So while all those images in the previous slide have issues with every single individual image, each of them contains areas that have good data. So you can see here on the left, we've got a time series of 6 images. Some have clouds, some have noise. But even though we have a lot of issues with each individual image, you can pull out good pixels from those images and then just analyze those. So what we do is we take a stack of images, we combine them using a algorithm which preserves the spectral characteristics of each band. And we basically create what we call a geomedian, which is it's effectively the most representative observation per pixel, so the highest quality observation per pixel. And the nice thing about this method, which was developed by some collaborators at ANU, is that this produces synthetic satellite observations which can be analyzed in the same way as you analyze an individual image. So you get this sort of synthetic, most representative image out of it, which then becomes a really nice clean data source for doing further analysis. So that's sort of the first method that we use a lot, crunching noisy data into one clean image. The next thing we use is methods to try to account for tide. So if you remember from the animation, we had all these images throughout the tide cycle. If we just tried to analyze that through time without accounting for the different tidal stages, we get a very misleading idea of how the coasts have changed. So what we can do is we can take our satellite imagery archive. We know where each image was taken, and we also know the time each image was taken. And what we can do is we can tag each of those images with a tide height based on a global tidal model. So here you've got on this graph on the right here, you can see the blue is the tidal range for a location in the Northern Territory. And the black is basically every time that we have a satellite image. So every single time Landsat has taken a photo of the coastline, we've got a black dot here. And so you can sort of see that we've got a whole spread of images from the lowest tide up to the highest tide. So with this information, we can start to sort of slice and dice our images, not just by time and location, but we can also slice and dice by tide height. So for example, we could pull out just the satellite images with the highest 20% of tide observations, or we can pull out just the lowest 20% of tides from the images. So this sort of method of calculating tides height for each image and then using that to filter and slice and dice imagery is sort of underpins one of our first coastal products, which I'm going to talk about here. So this is a product called the DEA high and low tide imagery products. And what we do is essentially we pull out what I showed in the previous slide. We pull out the lowest 20% of tides and the highest 20% of tides, and we combine them into a nice clean composite image. So this is an example of what this looks like for low tide up at Talbot Bay in the Kimberley. And so you can see here, we have some sort of pretty amazing low tide environments that appear when you start to filter by tide. So I'll just zoom in a little bit on this area. On the left, we have a tide height composite, a high tide composite made of just the highest 20% of observations. We can see up here, the black dots are the ones we've used to produce this. And on the right, we have a low tide one. And so you can see compared to the high tide image, you can see these sort of incredible sandbanks appearing and these sort of intertidal rocky platforms that are usually submerged. And so it kind of lets you effectively see through the water and start to get a really good spatial understanding of these different intertidal environments that are usually quite difficult to see if you're looking at individual images. So we can take that a little bit further. We can, rather than just looking at composites at high and low tide, we can also track high and low tide environments through time as well. So on the bottom here, we've got a low tide composite showing the sort of mangrove environments at low tide for each 5 years from 1988. And we can sort of track the development of this, this mangrove bank as it's slowly grown over the last 3 decades. And so by controlling for tide, we can start to sort of get a consistent idea of how these different intertidal ecosystems have changed through time. And so this has been used already for sort of mapping critical habitats of sawfish and different shorebirds in Northern Australia. And it really sort of starts to get data that can be used to understand the specific life history traits of these different organisms, which rely on different tidal cycles and different portions of the intertidal environments for their habitat. So while low and high tide, comparing images at low and high tide is a really sort of powerful technique, there's a huge amount of extra data we can also get by combining tide heights with satellite imagery. So you can see here at Roebuck Bay in WA, we've taken 32 years of satellite data, we've assigned each image a tide height, and we've sorted them from low to high tide. And you can sort of see these amazing patterns of the tide going in and out through time. And so you can sort of imagine that if you were to pull out these individual frames, you could start to get an idea of where the coastline was throughout the entire tide cycle, so from low tide to high tide, and everything in between. So that's sort of the next phase, moving from low and high tide to start to get doing a similar approach to all of the tide heights throughout the tide cycle for a given location. So just to put this on a sort of a tide graph, like I showed you before, we've got the same graph. We've got the black dots are the satellite observations. The gray is the astronomical tide range. And then we've got, we can basically, rather than just pulling out the top 20% and the lowest 20%, we can pull out a whole range of different bands. So we can pull out the lowest 10%, 20%, 30%, 40%, all the way through to start to classify our coastal landscapes into their different tidal regimes. So to put that on the map, we've got the same thing as in the previous figure. We've got red all the way through to blue. And so we've got down here, we've got our sort of low tide things that are only inundated at the sort of the very lowest tides, all the way up to the high tide. And so we've got these sort of different bars, which all represent different frequencies of flooding due to tidal effects. And so what we do is we take the imagery for each of those 10% of the tidal ranges, we crunch them into a composite image, like I showed you in the previous slide. We use a water index to extract the boundary, and so we get this output, which is a sort of a relative extent of the tidal zone at different portions of the tide range. So this is a product called the DA Intertidal Extents product. This is produced for Australia's entire coastline, and it really gives a pretty amazing view of these differences in the landscape between low and high tide. And so you can sort of imagine that this can be used for different applications. If you're sort of coastal infrastructure development, you'd obviously be caring about the high tide line. The sort of more habitat mapping applications and working out the extent of the intertidal zone across space, you'd be more interested in this low tide range. The problem with this data set, though, is even though it gives you a really powerful relative view of the coastline at different tidal stages, it is all relative. So it essentially tells you what areas are lower than others, but it doesn't tell you how low they are. But we can sort of extract that. So for this, we know where the shoreline is at different tide heights. We also know what the tide height was for each of the images that went into these. So what we can do is we can go a step further and we can start to assign this with actual absolute tide heights based on the times the images were acquired. So to do this, we essentially extract a contour along each of these different intertidal bands. And for each contour, we assign the contour with the height of all the images that went in to produce the median composites that we use to create it. So here you can see at the bottom, we've got a minus 2.5 meter AHD contour all the way up to 1.5 meters. And so these are heights relative to mean sea level for all of these contours in the image. From that, we can then use an interpolation method to essentially interpolate between these contours like you would in a normal elevation map. And so then you can produce a digital elevation model from low to high tide at that location relative to mean sea level. And so this has gone from a relative map of just showing where the low and high, what areas are inundated at low and high tide, to actually having absolute elevation values. So this method has been validated against coastal LiDAR data from all across northern and eastern Australia. And so we get some pretty encouraging results from this. So compared to LiDAR, we get an accuracy of about 40 centimeters, which is almost equivalent to the accuracy of a lot of bathymetric LiDAR itself. And so this works particularly well in sort of large, extensive sandy beach environments and tidal flats. We get less good results in rocky shores, essentially because our model relies on the patterns of water you see in a landscape, matching up with the actual tide heights we see. And what you get in these rocky shore environments up north is that you get water that pools on these rocky shelves for hours after the high tide recedes. So basically the satellite is seeing water, but the tide is low and it's getting confused between area. Like it's theoretically that water shouldn't be there, but it just lingers in the landscape for a long time. So we get some quite biased results. But for these sort of more sandy beach and tidal flat environments, we can get pretty nice elevation extractions from it. So this has been processed across Australia on our national supercomputer. So we now have the first source of elevation data for about 15,000 square kilometres of intertidal terrain. So you can see here at Forestio Bay in the Pilbara, we've sort of animated this, overlaid this with sort of the most recent satellite imagery. And you can sort of see all these amazing intertidal landscapes appearing. So these sort of barrier islands, and then these amazing muddy tidal flats that extend up to the high tide line. So there's a huge amount of spatial detail that you can use for this, that you can extract using this method. Just to show this a different way, we can also sort of plot the actual tides over the elevation models we've produced. So you can sort of see how the coastline changes from low to high tide, and the areas that are exposed at different tide portions of the tide range. And so we're sort of doing some further work on this with one of my colleagues to translate those elevations into sort of exposure lengths based on the tide cycle. So now that we know the elevation of the intertidal landscapes, it's also valuable to know how long they're exposed during each tidal cycle. And that some information can then be used for habitat mapping for different shorebird species that rely on different amounts of exposure in the coast. And so this a really exciting application of this data has been plugging some of the holes in Australia's national bathymetry data set. So along the coast, we often have pretty good bathymetric data out deep and good elevation data on the land. There's historically been a big gap along the intertidal zone, basically because it's really hard to survey there. If you're doing it by hand, you're probably going to get stuck. And if you're doing it by boat, you're probably going to get bogged when the tide recedes. So there's sort of historically been a gap along the coast. And so this data is then fed into some of our new 30-meter bathymetry models that has been a collaboration with Rob Beeman from James Cook University. This is to fill these gaps and start to get the first continuous elevation models from so the top of our mountains down to the very deep trenches along our coast. And we've also had some, just recently, some really exciting developments where some of these methods we've been developing have been applied in England. So these are some results from the UK Hydrographic Office's coastline mapping project, where they've mapped tide contour coastlines, so basically coastlines from the lowest tide to the highest tide, and also gone the next step further and produced elevation models for all of the English and Scottish coasts. And so this is a really sort of, I guess, a good sign of how powerful open source software and algorithms are, that you can basically take the code that was written for Australia, apply them in another continent, and get pretty decent results from it. So it's been really exciting to see these different methods start to appear over the last few years. There are some major limitations with these products. So one of the trickiest ones that affects a lot of our work is that, while it's sort of intuitively you'd think that satellites would capture the whole range of low to high tide, they don't capture. There's in certain locations along Australia's coastline, we basically never get images of the high tide or never get images at low tide. And this is because the satellites overpass between about 10 o'clock and 10:30 in the morning, so that they get nice sunny conditions with less shadows. But it does mean that if there is interactions between that 10:30 overpass time and the local tidal patterns, you end up with some locations where essentially you never capture those lowest tides and highest tides. And so you kind of get this biased impression. If you were to just analyze these without correcting for that effect, you start to get, in this location at the top, for example, you'd start to think that the tide never gets that low, whereas really the satellite's not taking pictures of it, and the opposite in the bottom one. They're also, to produce that sort of high quality elevation data, we require a lot of imagery. So we basically take the full 30-year stack of imagery and combine that into a single composite. And we flag the areas where we know change is happening, but we can't model reliable elevation there. So these are essentially static products that show sort of the average elevation throughout 30 years for areas that haven't changed. And so that's really sort of a big limitation if you want to use these sort of workflows for studying how our coastlines have changed through time. So we can sort of take the similar approaches, but start to look at them in a different way. So while the elevation products model the coastline at sort of multiple tide heights for a single epoch, we can actually flip that and start to look at the same tide height, but for multiple periods through time. And so this is the driving factor for the most recent part of our work, the Digital Earth Australia Coastlines product, which I'll talk about in these last slides. The first challenging question for when you're starting to control for tide and look at tides through time is what tide datum you use for controlling for the effects of tide. The convenient thing for us is that this decision is made for us by that issue of tide bias in the satellite data. So because there's locations where you never see high tide, never see low tide, those sort of any sort of consistent tide correction that tries to normalize to a high tide or low tide is going to miss a huge amount of data in areas and get a sort of misleading idea of coastal change. And so for this product, we've really focused on the mean sea level tide datum, because that's essentially the only reliable datum that is captured consistently, both spatially and temporally throughout the entire satellite record for Australia. So what we do is we take a stack of satellite images for each year on the left. These images are processed to remove clouds and really obvious processing areas in them. We then use a method where we essentially calculate the tide height for every single pixel in an image. So what we do is we produce tide heights along the coast and we interpolate them into the extents of the image. And then we use that to basically flag whether a pixel was captured at low tide or high tide throughout the tide series. Using that data, we can then filter out our highest and low tide observations and just get left with a sort of a central population of data, which is captured around approximately mean sea level tide. And so using that sort of pixel filtered and cloud mask data, we can then combine that into a single median composite image, which effectively represents dominant coastal conditions throughout the entire year period. So there's sort of a compromise we have to make here to get a sort of a consistent annual product. We do need to throw away a lot of this sort of higher frequency coastal variability, but we do get out a sort of a consistent image of the coastline that represents sort of the dominant beach conditions throughout that year period. From that image, we can then apply some remote sensing techniques to amplify the difference in water and noise, sort of exaggerate this the difference between land and water. And then we can use a subpixel coastline extraction algorithm to pull out an actual coastline vector along this data set at higher than the resolution of the Landsat input imagery. And so if you've used the CoastSat Killian versus CoastSat tool, this does a very similar thing. So it basically compares the wetness of two neighboring pixels and puts a line precisely between them rather than just simply saying this pixel's wet, this pixel's dry, we're going to draw a line straight down the middle. This sort of pulls out a sort of a more precise line by using its differences in how wet and dry each pixel is. So we've been, over the last year or so, we've been working with a whole range of stakeholders from sort of local governments, state governments, citizen science projects around the country, academic programs, to sort of get all the validation data we can to make sure that we have confidence that this product is telling us something real about how Australia's coastal landscapes have changed through time. So this is, so far we've been analysing about 58,000 data points across the country. So you can see these black dots on the map here. And also a sort of a range of data from different survey methods spread through time as well. So it's a pretty amazing data set of change. There is a lot of coastal monitoring data out there in Australia, but often it's been quite tricky to sort of gather it up and analyze it in a consistent way. So a huge amount of this work has just been processing this into consistent formats so that it can be used as validation data consistently through time. So you can see some of our early results here on the right here. We're getting pretty encouraging results for accuracy. So I guess an important thing to consider here is that this is accuracy on our ability to monitor the median position of the coastline for each year. So this isn't trying to accurately map each individual coastline, sort of day-to-day frequency or even instantaneous shorelines. This is sort of how well can we pick up the median position of the shoreline through time. This is sort of long-term processes. So this product's really designed for looking at sort of the last 30-year interannual multi-decadal scale change. And so you can see here at quite a few locations on the coastline, we get pretty encouraging results. This is one of the narrowbeam profiles where we're sort of picking up this median annual change at about a precision of about 3 meters, which is pretty exciting considering the input imagery is about 30-meter pixel resolution. And you can see this here, the gray bar here is the sort of the 30-meter, what we're extracting from 30-meter pixels. And up the top, this is a comparison with the Western Australia Department of Transport's photogrammetry based coastal movement lines. And while we're really picking up the same temporal trends through time, you can see that by doing this annually, we're picking up a whole lot of temporal detail which doesn't exist in their current coastal monitoring data sets. So sort of the hope with this is that for these sort of government bodies which are collecting this data regularly, this sort of satellite-based data can then fill some of these gaps and give us sort of a richer understanding and sort of fill in some of the temporal dynamics that are missing from their less regularly sampled data. So to show you what this data set looks like, we've essentially got 3 different layers that make up this product. So the first one is our annual coastlines layer, and these represent the median, also the dominant position of the coastline at mean sea level tide throughout the year period. And so these extend from 1988 to 2018. You can see here at a location in Busselton in WA, we've got pretty extreme erosion out to the west and progradation on the east side. And so what we can do is we can, using this data, using a 32 years of annual shoreline data, we can then start to pull out temporal trends. So for every 30 meters along the coast, we can basically measure the distance to each of these nearest shorelines, and then use that to create a sort of a simple regression model of how the coastline's changed. And so here you've got rates of change in meters per year since 1988, and also with a sort of an estimate of certainty based on the noise in the shorelines themselves. From this, we can then zoom out, and we have the final layer, which is what we call the hotspots of change layer, which basically summarizes these things at a really coarse scale across the coastline. And so this sort of is useful for working out these sort of big, broad landscape scale hotspots of coastal change, sort of erosional or progradational hotspots. Doing this for the whole country has now given us some pretty fascinating results about how Australia has changed over the last 32 years. So what we've found from analysing this of the rates of change points along the coast, we've actually found that most of Australia's non-rocky coastlines have been relatively stable since 1988. And so stable here is sort of referring to either shorelines that haven't moved at all or shorelines that have fluctuated around this sort of without a temporal trend through time. And this is quite different from sort of some of the other global coastal change monitoring, which has suggested that roughly about half of the world's coastlines have been changing at a really rapid rate of 0.5 meter per year. So we're getting very different results and much more stable conditions across Australia, which is we think is possibly to do with the more intensive tide correction that we've done in this product. However, of the sort of the coastlines which have changed, so there's been about 33% of coastlines which have retreated or grown significantly. About 15% of them, about 15% all up, have changed about 0.5 meter per year. So there still is some pretty dramatic change going on around the Australian coastline, but it is at a much lower rate than previous studies have suggested. And we have shown that of that coastal change, most shorelines in Australia are retreating. There's still a lot of progradation as well, but it's the dominant, the majority is retreat. But there are some sort of incredible examples of both progradation and extreme retreat along the coastline. So I'm just going to show you some of my sort of favorite examples we've found during this process, these different sites along Australia. So the first one is Point Stewart up in the Northern Territory. And so this is probably Australia's most intense erosional hotspot. So at this location, there's about 100-kilometre extent of coast, which has been eroding consistently at about 15 metres per year since 1988. So pretty extreme changes going on there. And this is sort of a combination of sort of a muddy mangrove coastline with some sort of small areas of sandy coast. And there's some pretty incredible places where you've got these, what we're sort of coining mangrove groins, where the mangroves have sort of lingered on the coast and protected small areas, and then the other areas of the sandy shore between them has eroded back. And so you get these kind of islands of mangroves sticking out into the water that is just sort of a sign of where the shoreline was 30 years ago. So this stuff has obviously been happening for a while, but it is an incredibly fast rate of change that covers a pretty amazing length of coastline up in the north. We can also look at change in much more complex environments. So here we've got an example at Barubbra Island near the Burnett River. And so we can see here that we've got this sort of amazing sandbar dynamics as the sort of sandbar has shifted over the last 30 years, including at about 2006, you can see the sandbar breach. And so you can sort of, animations are nice to see it visually, but you can also pull this apart and start to look at the different processes that were occurring at different times in the time series. So it's a really powerful tool for sort of diving deeper into these processes and trying to sort of look at the spatial dimension of this change that's occurred. And sort of the final example I'll show you, this is my personal favorite. This is at Twilight Bay in WA. And so at this location, essentially this beach has been remarkably stable for decades until about 1995, when suddenly, almost overnight, like within a 1-year period, we suddenly get 20 years progradation consistently that started in 1995 and has continued on since then. And so this beach has increased by about 0.5 kilometre in width over the last 30 years. And it's really happened since 1995 abruptly. So we can sort of, going back a bit deeper, this is an aerial photo supplied by Andy Short from 1972. We can see that the beach was still about the same in 1972 as it was in 1995, but then this change rapidly accelerated since then. That's just continued ever since. So we don't yet know why that's occurring at this point, and I've had some discussions with both Andy Short and Patrick Hesp about what their theories are for why this is occurring, but we do now have a really good spatial and temporal understanding of the sort of the when and the where of the changes, which hopefully can feed into a better understanding of some of these coastal processes that have occurred along Australia's coast. So for the last few minutes, I just want to show you a bit of a live demo of what some of these things look like on the map. All this data is available for free online to browse and download and analyze. So I'm just going to zoom out of this. Can you all still see this, the map on the screen? Yeah, cool. All right, so this is good. This is on a platform that is called the Digital Earth Australia Maps platform. And what this basically does is it holds all of our different satellite-based data sets. So it's an interactive map where you can browse and scroll around Australia's landscape and see how both coastal change through time and the sort of the physical characteristics of the landscape. So when you load this up, you'll get a map like this with these points here. And so these are the sort of the broad erosional and progradational hotspots along Australia's coast. And then as you zoom in, the data will start to adapt to what you're seeing on the screen. So at the moment, we've still got the hotspots. You zoom in one more, and then now you start to get the rates of change with their quantitative values. So for example, here you've got rates of change at about 13 meters erosion per year. And then as we zoom in even further, you get the actual annual median coastlines themselves. And you can sort of browse along the coastline like that. And so there's some really, I really encourage you to just have a look through this data. I've wasted far too much time just exploring it and seeing all of the amazing examples of geomorphic change that is happening around Australia's coastline. There's some sort of pretty incredible examples there, including some sort of more engineered examples. So here at Port Geograph, you can sort of see how the breakwaters at this marina development were reconfigured in the early thousands, basically because they were getting huge amounts of seagrass rack that was building up behind the breakwalls, and the local community wasn't happy with having rotting seaweed on their doorstep. So this entire engineered landscape had to be reconfigured, and you can sort of see how this has affected the coastline down drift of this development. And yeah, it's a really powerful tool for looking at these processes and also getting a spatial idea of how they've changed. So not just seeing the rates of change through time, but also looking at it visually and sort of tracking how these processes have occurred. An erosional example there. Yeah, so this is the coastlines product. There's also a bunch of other coastal data sets. If you go to explore map data, you can jump into the DA Intertidal products. So for example, we can put on the intertidal elevation model, zoom out up north where they have big tides. And you can sort of explore this data as well on the same map platform. So it can be quite powerful to sort of compare some of these data sets and sort of get sort of a better idea of both how the landscapes have changed, but also the sort of physical characteristics of the landscape in that intertidal zone. And finally, the low tide imagery, which I think is probably my favorite product just because it's such a beautiful data set. And so you can sort of explore this and see, compare the coastline at high and low tide, and also download that imagery and start to sort of actually analyze it. So if you want to do some habitat mapping based on low tide data, you can use that composite straight away. So just to finish up, there's a few sort of next steps for this work. So the next big one that's going to be happening in the next month or so is the release of the 2020 coastline. So this is sort of, our hope is that the coastlines product will be a continually updating data set that will be, every year there'll be fresh composite data for that last period. And yeah, so this is, again, this sort of long-term average shorelines, but there will be one for every year. So you can sort of compare this consistently through time. So this is at Stockton Beach, you can sort of see the pretty extreme erosion that's occurred there in the last few years. And so the next steps as well is starting to take some of these algorithms and apply them globally. So a sister project to the Digital Earth Australia program is the Digital Earth Africa program. And so this is an Australian government initiative to provide analysis-ready satellite data for the African continent. And so we've sort of done some very early experiments on the coastlines method in Africa. And so this is an example in Mauritania, up in Western Africa. You can see here in 1985, this breakwall for part of a port development was built. And then over the last 32 years, there's just been incredible coastal change here, as you've got extreme progradation updrift and then quite pretty extreme erosion downdrift. So it's, again, it's sort of a nice example of how open source code and products can be applied to anywhere that has satellite data and any way you can model tides. So that's sort of our hope. All of our products are open source and freely available. And the hope is that researchers such as yourselves can take this data, use it in your own workflows, and also hopefully suggest back ideas on how we can improve it. Because it's sort of early days for this stuff, and there's plenty of different ways the data can be sliced and diced and analyzed. So yeah, if you have any ideas or any sort of suggestions for how we can improve this, we'd really like to know. And yeah, very happy to collaborate or help on sort of our ideas of the best ways to get value from this. But yeah, I'd be very keen to see what you all think. So yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Robbi. That was fascinating, and I can see myself spending probably too many